So hello everyone, my name is Omer. I'm part of the Wiz product group. And today we're going to talk a bit about the way the AI era changed the way we looked at identity. First, kind of what this means for identity in general, what this shift even was, and then how security teams or identity security teams can look at this problem differently now that we have AI. So a bit of background into what this shift even is. So looking back into the way the cloud shift the way organization kind of work or operate. So it's pretty much changed the way any organization build or run the application. So infrastructure basically became code, deployment became much faster, pretty much instantaneous. And in order to secure platforms that operate that way, we needed to make a shift in our approach to security to work at dev speed. So being able to reduce silos of vertical security to horizontal security in order to kind of bring developers or enable them to reduce security risks. And by that, improving our speed of security significantly. Now, AI changes that even further. So first of all, we now build and ship code a lot faster. We also don't only ship code by developers. Now new teams get into the fray of releasing code, which means it doesn't always have an owner or quality may change between different teams. And also AI expands the attack surface of, in general, of the cloud or any organization by introducing AI services, agent MCPs, and other objects or aspects of AI that change the way we build. On the other hand, attackers are much more sophisticated in the way they can use those tools and models to actually attack or exploit a vulnerable organization. So first, they can model an unfamiliar code or API, organization, or application, which used to take days or weeks in minutes. They can automate the entire exploitation flow from end to end. They enable application-level attacks at a very large scale. And it really pretty much automates the entire understanding of how attackers look at the organization, which basically means that whenever there is an exploitation, they can take advantage of it very quickly. And in order to being able to tackle that and secure the organization, security teams have to also harness AI with their additional context, which is their kind of edge over the attackers, but they have the full organizational context, and adopt new strategies with the goal of making this not developer speed defense, but machine speed defense, allowing remediation, visualization, and governance with extreme speed in order to attack or solve the attacker problem. So let's talk a bit about specifically identity. So what changed from the identity perspective, not just the entire security perspective? So we can look at this in two ways. From one perspective, there are a lot of claims that nothing changed really, right? Because basically, identity is still foundational for security. The principles that we use to know for identity remains the same. Agents still need to authenticate using identities to perform actions. They are more ephemeral. We're using short-lived tokens, and they are delegated, but that context or concept still stands. Permissions still gate access in a way, although again, they can be exploited in much larger ways than before, but you still need permissions to understand what they can actually perform in the organization. We still care about least privilege to reduce that excessive access that an agent potentially has, so that really hasn't changed. And we still need visibility and governance tools to be able to understand what is running in terms of identity, but also build our governance structure to prevent any potential risk from reoccurring. So again, from the one hand, things are pretty much similar to before. However, from a lot of other aspects, things are completely changed, right? AI changes the identity security in multiple dimensions. So first, in scale, the amount of new agents and objects that are being used on the organization is really exploding. The speed in which they can make actions is also unbelievable in terms of autonomy of the agents and what they can do. And the complexity of the days and their actions potentially performed are much higher than they used to be. So agent can act autonomously across systems without any humans that is part of the process. Any permission that is granted to those agents can be directly transit into automatic action. Again, this is might not be used by a regular user, by a potential attacker can immediately take exploitation of that. And trust relationship that can create lateral movement paths that weren't available before. So agent to agent communication, agent meshes, and everything that kind of communicate between agents and allow them to gain excessive access or higher privileges with the AI workflow. So the principles haven't changed, but scale, speed, and autonomy and the number of objects that we have changed significantly, which is a pretty significant change to the way we look at identity. Now let's look at kind of the framework we can use in order to understand the identity realm with AI. So first, we still need visibility, but we now need to understand what agentic identities are within my organization and what that even is. So potentially any context that an agent has that is using an identity can make this identity more risky in my environment. So what types of agentic identities do I have? It could be that an agentic identity acts as a service account. It could be that a service account has a permission to invoke a model. It can be a user account that has permission to give a model to use its own permissions. So understanding all of that potential scenarios of agentic identities using or agent using agentic identities is kind of the factor here to get the visibility that you need to understand the environment. The second is a new layer of context, which we refer to now as identity intent, which is using other contexts we have on agents, like their system prompts, their tools, their skills, in order to determine upfront what are these agents actually supposed to do. And if we can translate that with our existing context into permissions that they can supposed to have, then we can have new types of visibility into whether I'm providing too many permissions to an agent that it doesn't really actually need, and then create workflows over that. We need to understand the identity risk, what can go wrong with identity security with agents. So lateral movement, as I mentioned before, is exploding now with agents or cross-agent communication. Also excessive access or privileged access in general, understanding those risks and visualizing them. And then the ability to govern and remediate at scale across how do I actually reduce that managed risk, but more importantly, how do I do that at machine speed in order to being able to prepare my organization for a potential exploitation. So let's start for visibility. So the blind spot now, as I mentioned, agentic identities. So they don't just magically appear in your IDP as I am an agentic identity. So you still need to get context from the organization in order to understand this identity is being used by an agent or is being part of an agentic workflow. Also, agent can work across multiple credential tokens and service accounts in one workflow, which makes, again, the context or the concept of visualizing everything that revolves around this identity extremely important to understand the actual risk. So if I'm saying an identity can access something, we now need to take into consideration a lot more context in order to be able to visualize it and to actually act on it. And also, visibility means seeing the full chain. Again, if a human gives the agent permission, the identity that it can assume other roles and tools that it uses to perform these actions, all of those are needed to understand the full scope of an agentic identity or an agent within my organization. Second is talking about intent, is access doesn't define the purpose of an agent. So permissions were, again, something we looked at a lot in order to gate potential excessive access, but we also use them to kind of understand what an identity used to do. But with agents, that's not really the case anymore, because we might grant permissions to a service account used by an agent that is much more excessive than what the agent actually needs to do. So, for example, in this example, if I have an agent that is supposed to access a docs, and I see that the service account allows them to get access to sensitive data of a very important bucket, then that permission mismatch between the intended permission and the granted permission, and that is something I want to act on, versus in the past where we compared the granted permission versus what he's actually using. Now agents will pretty much use whatever you give them in a lot of scenarios, and then we need to get another layer of excessive access remediation and control in order to being able to work our way around the security risk that this poses. Also, I mentioned that AI expands the opportunity for lateral movement pretty significantly. So agents can now query one another and get more context out of another agent. So if in the past we would look at a support agent has a service account with a read permission to a DB as kind of the full life cycle of that agent or that service account, now if that agent can speak to another agent and no guardrails are assigned here, the AI data agent can potentially give answers to a much lower privilege agent. And that can either say that they have effective access to other resources and permissions, but also it makes it so that it is super extremely important to being able to understand all of those hops between different agents to get the full understanding of an agent mesh or how agents communicate with one another and potentially allow granted or escalated permissions for another agent. So we really need to focus on identities with broad reach, understand how they are used by different agents, how agents communicate, and then we can have a visibility of, okay, these are the most risky agent or service account being used by agents that we need to gate to reduce security risk. So now let's look at machine speed remediation. So again, it's not enough to just understand there is security problem. We also need to be able to remediate that at large scale and very fast in order to have a chance against sophisticated attackers. So if in the past, for example, we used to give recommendations to reduce a potential principal permissions because they're excessive, we now need to shift our approach to much broader recommendations. So reducing the amount of policies that we have so they don't get exploited by an agent, making a singular action to reduce the most amount of policies or group them into a single policy, and basically consolidate policies per identity in order to make it right size for the identity or agentic identity world. Second is less radius prioritization. So instead of looking at security based on existing guardrails or things we don't want potential access to, we now are trying to find the minimum amount of actions we can make to reduce the most amount of identity risk within my environment at scale and at code. So one role fix that will give you the most impact on identity risk within my organization. And the third is lateral movement. Again, if in the past we looked at principles that can potentially laterally move to higher privilege status, now we need to look at this much broadly. What are the choke points on my lateral movement paths that contributes to the most amount of risk that an agent can exploit around my organization, and how can we fix those choke points to reduce the most amount of risk? All of those, not just seeing the risk at a higher scale, but also remediating that with singular actions in code automatically over time, is the way to actually reduce the risk in a profound way to allow the organization to be secured from an identity perspective. So where can we start when we start looking at identity in this new world? We already talked about a lot of these things, but generally we want to inventorize identities. So understanding and classifying what are my human, my regular non-human identities, and what are the agentic identities or the ones that are part of an agentic workflow is extremely important. That requires a lot of context and require understanding the use cases the organization has, whether again it's an agent using a service accounts, whether it's user accounts or human users giving models permissions, whether it's service account with permissions to invoke a model, or any other use case that we want to cover. We want to understand their effective access, not just again the normal, okay, they have an access to a service account, whether the agent can access another agent, can query another agent, can get more permissions or knowledge without even having those permissions assigned to it, and what permission do they have and what level of trust each agent has are also extremely important. And the relationships and context between different agents and service accounts is also very important to actually get the visibility. The inventory is not just knowing what IDPs or service accounts or user accounts do I have. The second is to try and get an understanding of the intent of an agent. So there are now tools that allows you to, from the agent system prompts, tools, skills, understand what the agent is supposed to do and what permissions that purpose translate to. And then that gives you a lot of context for first potential exploitation, what types of agent intent do I want to govern? What agent intents are using too many permissions from what they were assigned to, or just generally understanding better what agents are doing versus what they're intended is an extremely important step to visualizing their organization much better. We want to understand trust policies and relationships. So trust boundaries, want to prioritize lateral movement and understanding who can access what based on trust, tokens, and authentication. We want to protect the sensitive systems. So knowing which type of sensitive data is being accessible by an agentic identity is also extremely important to secure yourself from potential AI-led attack. And how do I govern continuously? How do I review it continuously and automatically over time? It is not enough to have a quarterly program to reducing excessive access or to reduce identity access. This needs to create a governance plan and act on it continuously and automatically at machine speed in order to be able to tackle those risks and not be exposed yourself. And lastly, a few words about the way Wiz tackles that problem. So Wiz first, we use our broad context from code, cloud, and runtime. The fact that we can have context from all those aspects of cloud development, the way it runs on the cloud, and the way it actually operates and manifests in attacks on the organization is extremely important to get the context you need to actually understand if this is an agentic identity. Was it built in code in that way? Does it run that way in the cloud? Does it act the way we expect it to on runtime? And then correlate all that information to understand the risk and then resolve it. We also introduced 3 new agents, the red agent that is basically an automatic pen tester that understands your exploitations, exploits, and kind of uses them. The blue agent that maps risks and understand it either in runtime or in cloud, and the green agent, which is the automatic remediation agent that basically allows us to do that remediation at machine speed. So getting all of that context across code, cloud, and runtime, and then giving the automatic agent that empowers you to resolve it at scale, and then using that across the entire lifecycle. The move to AI in the identity world first is part of a more broad change in the way organizations are shifting the way they develop, and then the level of how fast they are shipping code, how fast they need to remediate risks in order to withstand the onslaught from potential attackers that have those models as well. They need to rely on context. They need to get full visibility of AI identities, agentic identities, and the way they operate on the organization. They need to have visibility to potential lateral movements, communications between agents, and new risk factors that those agents pose in organization. And then they need to be able to remediate that at scale, quickly, at machine speed.